I am Diane Vance, 58, and for 15 years I believed my son Tyler loved me for my sacrifices, not just my millions. But last Saturday, at the rain-slicked Seattle waterfront, his fiancée Chloe accidentally hit reply all on an email, triggering an irreversible chain reaction that changed everything. What did they actually think of me? A low-class junkyard queen, to be banned from the grand opening, a social embarrassment, and a target to be discarded the second the lease was signed. In just 24 hours, my entire maternal devotion evaporated into a legal war zone. At the center of it all stood Tyler, quietly adjusting his silk tie with slightly trembling hands, completely oblivious that his betrayal had already been exposed. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice and family boundaries, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. My phone had stopped vibrating, not because the people on the other end had finally given up, but because the battery had surrendered after the 57th missed call. I stared at the dark, lifeless screen lying face down on my heavy oak kitchen table while the cold Pacific Northwest rain tapped softly against the windows of my home overlooking the gray waters of Puget Sound. The silence inside the house should have felt peaceful, a welcome reprieve from a chaotic day. Instead, it felt like the suffocating weight of the eye of a hurricane. Then my doorbell rang. Once, twice, and then a third time, loud and persistent. Whoever was standing out there in the damp Seattle chill had no intention of leaving. I stood up slowly, the joints in my knees aching slightly from a lifetime of hard work, and walked toward the front entrance. My hand rested on the cold brass handle as another heavy knock rattled the wood. "Mom, please, I know you're in there." It was my son, Tyler. The very same son who, barely 2 hours earlier, had sat on the other end of a phone line and calmly explained that I was not welcome at the grand opening gala of his new business. My name is Diane Vance. I am 58 years old, and if there is one harsh truth life has carved into my bones, it is this: the people who can break your heart the fastest are the ones you spent your entire life protecting. That morning had started like any other Saturday. I woke long before the sun had even cleared the Cascade Mountains, brewed a pot of strong, black coffee, and walked out onto my deck. From there, I could look down toward the industrial waterways where the massive cranes of the port stood like sleeping giants against the dawn sky. Even after nearly 40 years in the industrial recycling and scrap metal business, I never got tired of watching the morning fog roll off the salt water and settle over the yards. My late husband, Marcus, used to say the stacks of salvaged iron and copper looked like a modern sculpture park if you caught them in the right light. He had been gone for 15 years now. A stubborn lung disease from his early days as a shipyard welder didn't care how decent a man he was, nor did it care that a teenage boy still desperately needed his father. After Marcus passed, my entire universe narrowed down to Tyler. Every school project, every late-night fever, every parent-teacher conference, every scraped knuckle, and every quiet disappointment, I was there for all of it. I passed up lucrative corporate mergers because the negotiations would take me away from home for too many weeks. I turned down invitations to sit on prestigious regional boards because Tyler needed someone to help him study for his college entrance exams. I drove the same dented, heavy-duty utility truck for a decade because his private tuition and his early real estate ventures mattered more than my comfort. I never regretted a single sacrifice. Not once. At least, not until today. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I had called Tyler to ask a simple, practical question. "Hey, kiddo," I said when he finally picked up, the background noise of his car hands-free system humming in the background. "What time do you need me at the terminal next Saturday?" I know grand openings are a logistical nightmare, and I figured I could show up early to help the caterers or coordinate with the security team. There was a long, empty silence on the line. It wasn't the comfortable, easy silence we usually shared when we were working on a project together, nor was it the thoughtful pause of a businessman calculating a response. This silence felt heavy, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. Finally, Tyler cleared his throat, his voice sounding tight and strained. "Mom." "Yeah. Actually, I've been meaning to call you about that. Okay, I murmured, a cold knot beginning to form in my stomach. Go ahead. Another agonizing pause stretched between us. Then he spoke the words that I knew would remain burned into my memory for as long as I lived. I don't think it's a good idea for you to come to the gala. I let out a short, dry laugh. I didn't laugh because I found it amusing, I laughed because the statement sounded so utterly absurd, so entirely detached from reality, that my brain refused to process it. What on earth are you talking about, Tyler? It's complicated, Mom. No, son, it really isn't, I replied, my voice dropping into the quiet, steady register I used when a business negotiation was turning south. I'm listening. Tell me. His voice grew even quieter, losing all of its usual confidence. Chloe doesn't want you there. I blinked, staring out at the gray drizzle blanketing the sound. I'm sorry. Did I hear you correctly? She thinks. He cut himself off, exhaling a sharp, frustrated breath. What does she think, Tyler? She thinks your presence might make some of the investors and high-profile guests uncomfortable. I honestly believed, for a fraction of a second, that this was some sort of cruel, misguided joke. Tyler. Say that again. He took a deep, shuddering breath. My fiancé doesn't want you at the grand opening, Mom. The word stung, a sharp prick of disbelief. But what he said next cut far deeper, slicing through decades of maternal devotion. She says. His voice practically evaporated into a whisper. She says you're an embarrassment to the brand we're trying to build. I looked out across the water toward the distant docks, toward the very industrial yards I had spent nearly 4 decades building from a single rented flatbed truck into a regional empire. The same empire that had funded Tyler's elite education, paid for his upscale apartment, and provided him with the financial backing to even dream of entering the high-stakes world of commercial development. I wasn't angry yet. Mostly, I was just profoundly confused. An embarrassment, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Tyler rushed to fill the silence, his words tumbling out in a defensive panic. Mom, please, it's not personal. You have to understand the crowd we're dealing with here. The Sterling's associates, the medical community, the high-end wellness investors, they're different. I've met Chloe's parents, Tyler. They run private wellness clinics. They aren't royalty. They're just, more refined, Mom. They move in different circles. Refined, I said, almost laughing again. I had built one of the largest independent industrial recycling operations in the Pacific Northwest. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar supply contracts with international shipping lines, navigated complex environmental regulations, and quietly donated millions to local trade schools and community clinics without ever asking for my name to be carved into a single block of granite. Yet, somehow, because I preferred canvas work jackets to designer silk and spent my days dealing with salvaged metal, I wasn't refined enough to stand in a room that my own hard work had paid for. Is this really Chloe talking, Tyler? I asked quietly. Or is it you? He didn't answer. And in my line of work, I had learned long ago that silence always tells the truth that words are too cowardly to admit. I closed my eyes, the memory of the previous week washing over me. Just 7 days ago, I had stood with Tyler and Chloe on the polished concrete floor of the historic waterfront terminal building. Chloe had wept tears of pure joy as I handed them a leather document folder. Inside was the fully executed master lease and purchase option for the $8.5 million heritage property, a gift to help them launch their flagship aesthetic institute. I hadn't done it because they asked, I did it because I wanted my son to have a foundation, a legacy of his own to build upon. Chloe had thrown her arms around my neck, her designer perfume filling my senses. Oh my God, Diane, she had sobbed against my shoulder. This is absolutely life-changing. We could never have secured this location without you. And Tyler had hugged me tighter than he had since he was a boy. I don't even know how we'll ever repay you for this, Mom. You don't have to repay me, I had told them, patting his back. Just build something you're proud of. Now, exactly 1 week later, I was deemed too unpolished, too low class, to even cross the threshold of that very building for their celebration. Tyler, I finally said, my voice steady and cold. Yeah, Mom. I hope your grand opening is everything you want it to be. Mom, look, I'm sorry. So am I interrupted gently. There was another heavy silence. Then, I said the only thing left to say to a son who had decided his own mother was a social liability. Understood. I ended the call. There was no screaming, no dramatic accusations, no attempts to make him feel guilty. I simply set the phone down on the counter and walked into my study, a room that still carried the faint, comforting scent of old paper and Marcus's cedar chest. On the wall hung a collection of framed photographs spanning 35 years of a quiet, hard-working life. There was Tyler learning to ride his bicycle on the gravel path behind our old shop, Tyler standing proudly in his high school graduation gown, the two of us on a cold, misty fishing trip near the San Juan Islands, smiling through the rain because we hadn't caught a single thing but had spent the whole day laughing. I picked up one small, silver-framed picture. Tyler was 7 years old, missing his front teeth, holding my grease-stained hand in the middle of our first real scrapyard. Back then, he thought I was the strongest, smartest person in the world. I wondered, with a dull ache in my chest, exactly when that little boy had vanished. I sat in the quiet of my study for nearly 2 hours, watching the rain streak down the glass. Then, my phone began to vibrate again. And again. And again. I didn't touch it. When the battery finally died and the screen went black, I turned it over. 57 missed calls. And now, the doorbell was ringing again, followed by a heavy, desperate knock. I walked slowly to the front door, turned the lock, and pulled it open. Standing on my porch in the damp Seattle mist was not Tyler. It wasn't Chloe, and it wasn't her parents. It was Arthur Pendleton, my corporate attorney, holding a thick leather briefcase. Arthur stepped inside, shaking the cold Seattle rain from his dark wool coat. He looked older than his 62 years in the dim light of my hallway, his shoulders slightly stooped under the weight of the leather briefcase he carried. He had been my corporate attorney for nearly 25 years, a man who had helped Marcus and me navigate the treacherous waters of maritime contracts, environmental permits, and municipal zoning laws as we slowly built Vance Industrial from a single scrap metal yard into a regional powerhouse. He wasn't a lawyer who thrived on courtroom dramatics, he was a master of structure, trusts, and the quiet legal frameworks that kept family businesses from tearing themselves apart from the inside out. Coffee? I asked, my voice sounding flat and hollow even to my own ears. Arthur nodded slowly, his expression grave. Please, Diane. Black is fine. Neither of us spoke while I poured 2 mugs of the strong, dark roast I had brewed earlier. The kitchen was silent except for the rhythmic, soft dripping of the rain against the glass deck doors. Arthur placed his thick leather briefcase on the oak table but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at me with an expression of quiet sympathy, the same look he had given me 15 years ago when we stood in the rain at Marcus's funeral. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice quiet. I forced a faint, tired smile and sat down opposite him. You already know, then. I received several calls on my way over here, Arthur said, cradling his mug to warm his hands. First from Tyler. Then, about 10 minutes later, from Julian Sterling. Julian? I raised an eyebrow. Chloe's father. Why would he be calling you? He sounded desperate, Diane. Panicked, even. That caught my attention. Julian Sterling was a man who prided himself on absolute control. He was the polished, pristine face of a highly lucrative chain of private wellness and medical aesthetics clinics in the Pacific Northwest. He was a man who wore bespoke suits to casual lunches and spoke in the measured, soothing tones of a high society doctor. For him to sound desperate to my corporate attorney meant something had gone terribly wrong with their carefully laid plans. I didn't answer Tyler's calls, I admitted, staring into my black coffee. I turned my phone off after he told me I wasn't welcome at the grand opening of the terminal. I spent 40 years working in the dirt and the grease, Arthur. I've got metal dust under my fingernails that will probably never fully wash out. But I never thought my own son would look at those hands and see something to be ashamed of. Arthur didn't interrupt. He knew when to let a client speak, especially a client who was also an old friend. He let the silence stretch for a moment before reaching for his briefcase. "Diane, there is something you need to see. It's the reason Julian Sterling is panicking." He opened the brass clasps of his briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of printed paper, and slid it across the table toward me. I stared at the text. It was an email, printed out only an hour earlier. At the top of the page, the sender's name was Chloe Sterling. "She didn't mean to send this to me," Arthur explained softly. "She was emailing her event planner and her marketing director, finalizing the VIP guest list and the ribbon-cutting details for tomorrow's gala. But she made a critical error. Because my email address was still attached to the active document thread regarding the property's master lease and occupancy permits, she accidentally hit reply all." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the heat of it burn my throat, and then I began to read Chloe's words. "Can you believe Diane actually thought she'd be standing on the stage with us for the ribbon cutting?" The email read. "Honestly, she would ruin the entire aesthetic of the launch. She smells like industrial diesel, wears those ridiculous canvas work jackets, and has absolutely zero class compared to the investors we have coming from Seattle and Vancouver. Tyler agrees it's best if she stays home. We can't have a low-class junkyard queen wandering around the VIP lounge. Besides, once the master lease transfer is fully executed next week, we won't have to play nice and pretend anymore." I read the last sentence 3 times. Not because the English was difficult to understand, but because my brain kept trying to find a way to reject the reality of what my son had agreed to. Tyler agrees it's best if she stays home. My mind flashed back to the previous week, to the bright, polished concrete of the waterfront terminal. I remembered the warmth of Tyler's hug, the tears in Chloe's eyes as she kissed my cheek and told me I was their savior. It had all been a performance. A calculated, transactional show designed to keep the junkyard queen happy just long enough to secure the keys to an $8.5 million piece of prime Seattle waterfront real estate. I folded the paper carefully, smoothing the crease with my thumb, as if being gentle with the physical page could somehow soften the blow to my chest. "I suppose," I whispered, "I finally know exactly what they think of me." Arthur looked me straight in the eye. "You know what Chloe thinks. And you know what Tyler was willing to tolerate to get what he wanted." "I wish I could say I was surprised," I said, looking out at the gray water of the Sound. "But real betrayal is never a sudden lightning strike. It's a slow accumulation of small details you chose to ignore because you loved them too much to see the truth. The way Chloe would subtly correct my posture at dinner. The way Tyler stopped inviting me to his lunches with his new real estate associates. The excuses. The cancelled Sunday dinners. I told myself he was just busy, that he was growing up and building his own life. I didn't want to admit he was actually pushing me into the shadows. "Diane," Arthur said, leaning forward and tapping the leather folder still resting in his briefcase. "There is a legal reality here that Chloe and her father have completely overlooked in their haste to exclude you." "What is it?" "The master lease and the commercial occupancy permit for the waterfront terminal building," Arthur said, pulling out a second document. "When we structured the acquisition of the property, we did it through Vance Industrial Holdings. Because of the city's pending zoning adjustments and the required environmental sign-offs for historical waterfront structures, the final transfer of the lease to Tyler and Chloe's new corporate entity was scheduled to take place after the grand opening gala." I stared at the document. "The transfer hasn't happened yet?" "No," Arthur said, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. "Legally, Vance Industrial Holdings still holds the master lease. The commercial occupancy permit, which allows any public event to take place inside that building, is issued solely to your company. Legally, Tyler and Chloe do not have the authority to host a single guest in that terminal tomorrow without your express, written authorization as the primary tenant. I looked out the window at the distant docks. The waterfront terminal was a beautiful, historic brick structure that had once housed steamship cargo. I had spent months negotiating with the port authority to secure it, using my decades of business goodwill and financial credibility to make the deal happen. It was a masterpiece of industrial architecture. And it was still mine. That is highly ironic, I murmured. Julian Sterling knows this, Arthur said. That's why he called me. Their marketing team has already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on catering, ice sculptures, high-end floral arrangements, and media coverage. The mayor is scheduled to attend the ribbon cutting. If the building remains locked tomorrow because Vance Industrial Holdings hasn't authorized the occupancy permit, the Sterlings will be ruined in the eyes of their high society investors. It will be a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Arthur closed his laptop and folded his hands on the table. Diane, as your attorney, I need to ask you. What do you want to do? I didn't answer him right away. I stood up and walked down the hallway of my home, looking at the photos of my family. I stopped in front of a picture of Marcus, his face lined with fatigue but his eyes bright with laughter, holding a newborn Tyler in our first tiny apartment. Marcus had always been the wiser of the two of us. When Tyler was a teenager and had lied about damaging one of our delivery trucks, I had wanted to ground him for a month. Marcus had stopped me. Diane, he had said, don't punish him out of anger. Teach him because you love him. If you always shield him from the consequences of his choices, he'll never learn where entitlement ends and character begins. I had forgotten those words. In the years after Marcus died, I had been so consumed with making sure Tyler never felt the sting of loss or the struggle of poverty that I had given him everything on a silver platter. I had raised a son who believed that my love, my money, and my sacrifices were simply his birthright, requiring nothing in return, not even respect. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at Arthur. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. I don't want to humiliate my son, and I don't want to destroy his future. But I will not reward disrespect. Generosity is a gift, Arthur, not a transaction to be tolerated until the ink on the contract is dry. Arthur nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet respect. So, we withhold the occupancy authorization? Yes, I said, my voice firming. Inform the venue manager and the port authority that Vance Industrial Holdings is delaying the final lease transfer and has not authorized the commercial occupancy permit for tomorrow's event. No drama. No public statements. Just the cold, hard legal facts. I barely slept that night. Not because I regretted my decision, but because I kept asking myself the same question over and over as the hours ticked away. When did my son stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as an obstacle to be bypassed? At 6:30 the next morning, I was already sitting on my back deck with a mug of black coffee. The Puget Sound was shrouded in a thick, gray fog that clung to the water like a heavy blanket. Down below, the industrial cranes of the port were barely visible, their yellow lights blinking slowly through the mist. The world was quiet, indifferent to the storm brewing in our lives. The tide still pulled, the rain still fell, and the city of Seattle slowly woke up to another damp Sunday. My phone, plugged into the kitchen wall and finally recharged, began to buzz. The screen lit up with Tyler's name. For the first time since our devastating conversation the day before, I slid the bar to answer. I placed the phone to my ear but said nothing. Mom. Tyler's voice cracked, thick with a panic I hadn't heard in him since he was a child. Thank God. Mom, something is wrong. I remained silent, listening to the heavy, uneven sound of his breathing. Mom, are you there? We're down at the terminal. The security team won't let us in. The catering trucks are lined up down the block, and the venue manager says there's a hold on the occupancy permit. He says it's a legal issue with Vance Industrial. I know, I said quietly. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. What do you mean, you know? Mom, did you do this? I looked out over the gray water, my voice steady. I asked Arthur to delay the final transfer of the lease, Tyler. And because the occupancy permit is tied to the primary leaseholder, I instructed him not to authorize public access to the building for today's event. A long, suffocating silence stretched over the line. I could hear the faint sound of car horns honking in the background, the distant shouting of stressed workers, and the unmistakable, sharp wind coming off the bay. You canceled my grand opening, Tyler finally whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. No, Tyler. I canceled nothing, I replied. Your business is still yours. Your partnership with the Sterlings is still intact. You are entirely free to host your gala anywhere you can find a space. But you are not free to celebrate your future on property that legally belongs to me. Mom, this is insane. You know how much money is on the line here. The investors, the press, the mayor's office, they're all supposed to be here in 3 hours. You're ruining my life. I am enforcing a boundary, Tyler. There is a difference. This is revenge, he spat, his tone hardening into something ugly and defensive. You're doing this because of what Chloe said. It was just an email, Mom. She was stressed. People say things they don't mean when they're under pressure. She meant every word, Tyler. And more importantly, you agreed with her. You sat on the phone and told me I was an embarrassment to the brand you wanted to build. You were perfectly happy to let me buy the building, but you wanted me to slip out the back door so your new friends wouldn't have to look at the woman who paid for it. Before he could answer, I heard a muffled, angry voice in the background. It was Chloe, her high-pitched tone sharp even through the speaker. Tell her she's destroying our reputation. Tell her we'll sue. Tyler must have covered the receiver, because the sound cut out for a moment. When he came back, his anger had vanished, replaced by a desperate, pleading tone that made my heart ache. Mom, please. I need you. If this gala doesn't happen, the Sterling's investors are going to pull out. We'll lose everything before we even start. Please, Mom. Just sign the temporary waiver. I'm begging you. For a split second, the decades of maternal instinct screamed at me to yield. I saw the little boy who used to run to my bed after a nightmare, crying that he needed me to make the world safe again. Mom, I need you. The memory hit me like a physical blow, threatening to shatter my resolve. But then I remembered the email. I remembered the cold, calculated plan to discard me the moment the paperwork was finalized. Tyler, I asked softly, do you need me, or do you need my building? He didn't answer. And that silence, once again, told me everything I needed to know. Goodbye, Tyler, I said, and ended the call. An hour later, my landline rang. It was a number I rarely used, but a few local businesses still had it. I picked up the receiver. Diane Vance, a woman's voice asked. She sounded completely exhausted, her breathing shallow. Speaking. My name is Susan. I'm the lead event coordinator for today's gala at the terminal. I know I shouldn't be calling you directly, but it is absolute chaos down here. The florists are trying to keep thousands of dollars of custom arrangements from wilting in the rain. The catering staff is standing on the docks, and the classical musicians are packing up their instruments because their contracts don't allow them to wait in the damp air. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, Susan. Truly. I've been planning high-end corporate events in Seattle for 22 years, Diane, Susan said, her voice dropping to a quiet, professional murmur. I've dealt with power outages, catering disasters, and runaway clients. But I have never seen a primary benefactor locked out of their own building by the people they funded. I saw the email, Diane. It was forwarded to my team by mistake in the mass reply. I remained silent, waiting. I just wanted to ask you one thing, Susan continued gently. Did you really intend for it to end like this? No, I answered honestly. I intended to keep a promise to my late husband, and to myself. A promise that I would never teach my son that respect is optional, or that generosity is a weakness to be exploited. There was a long pause on the line. Then, Susan let out a soft, weary sigh. I wish more families had the courage to teach that lesson. For what it's worth, Diane. I don't think you're the villain of this story. After we hung up, the quiet of the house felt heavier. I decided I couldn't stay inside staring at the walls anymore. I put on my old canvas work jacket, pulled on my boots, and drove my utility truck down to the local market near the shipyards to pick up some basic groceries. In a tight-knit industrial community like the Seattle docks, news travels faster than the morning tide. The moment I walked into the small grocery store, the cashier, a young woman whose father had worked for Vance Industrial for 15 years, gave me a tentative, sympathetic look. "Morning, Miss Vance," she murmured. Well, we heard about the terminal. I'm real sorry about the mess." "Thank you, sweetie," I said, offering a tight smile. As I walked back out to my truck with a single bag of groceries, an elderly man in a faded blue shipyard cap stepped out from the diner next door. It was Hank Miller, a retired master welder who had worked alongside my husband Marcus back when we were still salvaging copper from old barges. "Diane," Hank said, tipping his cap. "Hank. Good to see you. How are the knees?" Aching with the rain, as usual, he smiled, though his eyes were serious. "I heard about what went down at the waterfront terminal this morning. Word gets around the docks fast." I sighed, looking down at my boots. "I didn't want it to be a public spectacle, Hank." Hank stepped closer, his voice rough but incredibly kind. "Listen to me, Diane. Your Marcus was a good man, and you're a good woman. You built this town's industry with your own 2 hands. My father used to tell me something when I was a young hothead: if someone is ashamed of the hand that fed them, they're probably not hungry enough yet. You did the right thing today." He patted my shoulder with a calloused hand and walked away before I could find the words to thank him. When I drove back up the winding hill to my home, I saw 3 large, polished black SUVs parked along the gravel shoulder outside my security gate. The doors opened, and Julian and Victoria Sterling stepped out into the misty rain. They looked entirely out of place against the rugged, rain-slicked trees of my property, but the arrogance that usually defined them was gone. They looked defeated. And they were waiting for me. I pulled my utility truck up to the heavy iron security gates of my property, the tires crunching loudly on the wet gravel. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched Julian and Victoria Sterling step out of the middle SUV. Julian, usually the picture of tailored perfection, had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a damp cashmere overcoat. Victoria stood beside him, holding a large black umbrella that trembled slightly in the cold wind blowing off the sound. I put the truck in park, killed the engine, and stepped out into the damp air. I didn't say a word as I walked to the gate, inserted the heavy brass key into the padlock, and swung the iron doors open. "Diane," Julian said, his voice stripped of its usual smooth, clinical warmth. He looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes weren't the product of a single bad morning, they looked like the culmination of a very long, very public disaster. "Julian." "Victoria," I nodded, keeping my hands in the pockets of my canvas work jacket. "It's cold out here. We can sit on the back patio. It's covered." I led them around the side of the house, past the stacks of seasoned firewood and the weathered cedar decks, to the covered patio that overlooked the gray, mist-shrouded waters of Puget Sound. I went inside briefly to pour 3 glasses of iced tea, placing them on the rustic stone table. Neither of them touched their drinks. The silence between us was punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic dripping of rain from the cedar overhang. Finally, Victoria spoke. She took off her leather gloves, her hands shaking slightly. "Diane. I owe you an apology. We both do." I looked at her, surprised by the lack of defensive posture. "For what, Victoria?" "We knew Chloe wanted a highly curated guest list," Victoria said, her eyes dropping to the stone table. She told us she wanted to focus strictly on medical aesthetics investors and high society donors. But we had no idea, we had absolutely no idea she had explicitly uninvited you. Or that she had spoken about you in such a vile, disrespectful manner. Julian let out a heavy, ragged sigh, rubbing his temples with his fingers. When the venue manager called us this morning to tell us the building was locked down by Vance Industrial, we were already in our formal wear, on our way to the ribbon cutting. I demanded to know what was happening. That was when Arthur Pendleton forwarded Chloe's email to my personal address. He looked up, his eyes filled with a genuine, deep-seated mortification. I raised my daughter to be ambitious, Diane. But I did not raise her to be cruel. To read those words, to realize she was using your immense generosity while planning to discard you like piece of scrap metal. I have never been more ashamed. I remained quiet, letting his words hang in the damp air. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I realized I wasn't the only parent grieving on this rainy Sunday. Julian Sterling was a proud man, perhaps too focused on image and status, but he was still a father who had just realized his child's character was hollow. The gala is ruined, of course, Julian continued quietly. The catering trucks have departed, the investors have returned to their hotels, and the local press is already asking questions about a contractual dispute at the terminal. But that is secondary. What matters is that our daughter has disgraced herself, and she has disgraced our family name. Before I could respond, the sound of a roaring engine echoed from the front driveway. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the gate, its tires spraying gravel. The driver's side door flung open, and Tyler stepped out. He didn't look like the confident, sharp-dressed young developer who had stood beside me a week ago. His tuxedo jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his black silk tie hung completely loose around his neck. His polished leather shoes were covered in a layer of wet gravel dust from my driveway. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a mixture of panic and profound regret. Julian stood up slowly, adjusting his coat. "I think this conversation belongs to the two of you," he said, looking at Tyler and then back to me. Victoria nodded, pulling her gloves back on. "We'll wait in the car, Julian." They walked past Tyler without speaking. Julian paused for a fraction of a second, placing a brief, heavy hand on my son's shoulder, before continuing down the gravel path. Within moments, the patio was silent again, save for the wind rustling through the pine trees. Tyler walked toward the patio slowly, his steps heavy and hesitant. He stopped a few feet away from the stone table, his hands hanging limply at his sides. For nearly a minute, neither of us said a word. He looked out at the gray water of the Sound, then down at his dusty shoes. "I've never noticed how peaceful it is up here," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. I offered a sad, tired smile. "You've been too busy to notice, Tyler. You've been running so fast you forgot to look at the ground beneath your feet." "I guess I have," he said, lowering his head. I didn't rush him. At 58, I had learned that the most important conversations in life don't begin with grand speeches or angry accusations. They begin with the heavy, honest weight of silence. Finally, Tyler took a deep, shuddering breath and looked me in the eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom." "For what, Tyler?" He hesitated, looking confused. For yesterday. For the gala. For everything." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. "No. That's too easy, son. I want you to tell me exactly what you are apologizing for." He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He closed his mouth, took a moment, and then whispered, "I chose the easy path." "Keep going," I said softly. "I knew Chloe didn't want you there," he admitted, a tear finally escaping and running down his cheek. "I knew it was wrong. I knew how much you had sacrificed to buy that terminal for us. But every time I tried to argue with her, she'd tell me I was choosing my past over our future. She'd say we needed to present a certain image to get the clinic off the ground. And I gave up. I kept telling myself it was only one day. I told myself that after the grand opening was over, after the investors were locked in, everything would go back to normal and I'd make it up to you. He let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. I guess I was just lying to myself so I wouldn't have to face what a coward I was being. When did you stop standing up for the people who stood up for you, Tyler? I asked, the question heavy with 40 years of shared history. His shoulders shook, and he covered his face with both hands, his chest heaving as the weight of his choices finally broke through his defenses. I don't know, Mom. I don't know. I stood up from the table, walked to the edge of the patio where the rain misted against the cedar railing, and looked down toward the old shipyard docks. Tyler followed me, standing a few feet away. Do you remember the old welding shop near the dry docks? I asked. The one your father and I rented when we first started? He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Yeah. You kept a box of Marcus's old welding goggles and his first copper hammer under the workbench. I still have them, I smiled gently. When your father was dying in that hospital room, he wasn't worried about the business. He knew I could handle the contracts and the yards. He was worried about you. He was afraid that because I loved you so much, I would spend the rest of my life trying to protect you from every hard truth, every struggle, and every consequence. He told me, Diane, promise me you won't confuse protecting him with rescuing him. Someday, he'll have to learn that love doesn't mean saying yes to everything. Tyler didn't speak. He just stood there in the cold rain, listening to his father's words echoing through the decades. I broke that promise, Tyler, I said, looking at him. I made things too easy for you. I let you believe that my hard work, my reputation, and my resources were just tools for you to use to build a life that you were ultimately ashamed to share with me. Did you ever actually plan to give us the terminal? Tyler asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Of course I did, I replied. I spent $8.5 million of Vance Industrial's capital to secure that historic lease. I don't play games at that price, Tyler. I wasn't buying your obedience. I was trying to build your legacy. Tyler reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and unlocked the screen. I think you should read these, he said, handing the device to me. I need you to know that I didn't agree with what she was doing. Even if I was too weak to stop it. I took the phone. The screen displayed a long, exhausting thread of text messages from Chloe, spanning the last 6 months. Your mother always has to wear those awful work clothes, one message read. Can't she just dress like a normal person for once? My parents' friends are going to think we come from a junkyard. Another one, sent just weeks ago, we need to phase her out of the public launch, Tyler. Once the master lease transfer is legally complete, we won't have to keep pretending to value her input. We are building a different kind of life now. You need to choose who you belong to. I slowly handed the phone back to him, my heart feeling lighter, not because the words didn't hurt, but because the truth was finally entirely in the light. You knew she felt this way, I said. And you still defended her. I thought marriage meant supporting your partner, no matter what, Tyler whispered. It does, I said, looking him dead in the eye. But not when your partner asks you to betray the very foundation of who you are. Just as the silence settled over the patio, the sound of another car door slamming echoed from the driveway. Heavy, hurried footsteps marched up the gravel path. It was Chloe. She stepped onto the covered patio, and for a brief second, I almost didn't recognize her. The elegant, custom-tailored designer gown she had chosen for the grand opening gala was wrinkled and damp. The hem of the delicate cream silk was stained with dark mud from my driveway, and her meticulously styled hair had fallen into wet, tangled strands around her face. Her makeup, once flawless, was smudged from what looked like a mixture of rain and furious tears. She looked like a ghost of the high society world she so desperately craved. She stopped at the edge of the patio, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger directly at me. This is unbelievable, she hissed, her voice trembling with a toxic mix of anger and humiliation. You ruined us. You destroyed our entire launch, our reputation, everything we've spent the last year building. All because of your fragile, pathetic ego. I remained seated, keeping my hands wrapped around my cold glass of tea. No, Chloe, I said, my voice quiet and steady. I didn't destroy anything. You did. She let out a sharp, sarcastic laugh, looking to Tyler for support. Oh, please. You locked us out of our own building. You embarrassed us in front of the city's biggest investors, the press, my parents' friends. Do you have any idea what people are saying down at the harbor right now? They're laughing at us. They are laughing, Tyler said. Chloe froze, turning her sharp gaze to him. What did you say? Tyler stood up slowly. The frantic, terrified look he had worn when he first arrived had vanished, replaced by a strange, heavy calm. He looked at his fiancée, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. My mother didn't humiliate us, Chloe, Tyler said, his voice barely louder than the wind. We humiliated ourselves. She just stopped pretending that it was okay. Chloe stared at him in utter disbelief. Are you seriously taking her side right now? After what she did to us? She just cost us millions in potential investments. What investments, Chloe? Tyler asked, taking a step toward her. The ones built on a lie. The ones we tried to secure by pretending my mother didn't exist. By hiding the woman who literally bought the roof over our heads because we thought her clothes weren't expensive enough for your friends. I was trying to build a brand, Tyler, she screamed, her voice cracking. I was trying to build a life for us. A life where we didn't have to spend our weekends in a filthy, noisy scrapyard smelling like industrial grease. I did this for us. No, Tyler said, shaking his head slowly. You did it for you. And I was too much of a coward to stop you. I let you make me ashamed of the person who gave me everything. Chloe looked from Tyler to me, her face twisting into an expression of pure venom. This is what you wanted, isn't it, Diane? You wanted to tear us apart. You wanted to prove that you still control him. I stood up from my chair and walked over to where she stood. Even in her high heels, she seemed small, shivering in the damp Seattle breeze. What I wanted, Chloe, I said softly, was to sit in the front row of my son's grand opening. I wanted to watch him succeed. I wanted to take one photograph with my family to put on the wall in my study. That is all I wanted. But you didn't care enough to ask. You just assumed that because I work with my hands, I don't have a heart. Chloe had no response. She stood there, her wet silk dress clinging to her, her lips parted but silent. The arrogance that had fueled her for months seemed to evaporate, leaving behind nothing but the cold reality of a ruined afternoon. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked back down the gravel path. She didn't slam her car door this time. She simply got into her sedan and drove away, the sound of her engine fading into the distance until there was only the quiet patter of the rain. Tyler watched the gate where her car had disappeared. I don't think she's coming back, he said quietly. Some journeys are meant to be walked alone, Tyler, I replied. He turned back to me, his eyes red and swollen. Mom, if you could go back to last week, would you still buy the waterfront terminal? I looked out over the gray waters of the Sound, watching a distant cargo ship slowly make its way toward the open ocean. I would still buy it, I said, turning to him and placing a hand on his shoulder. But this time, I would have spent a lot more time teaching you how to deserve it. Tyler's shoulders shook, and he stepped forward, burying his face in my shoulder just as he had when he was a little boy. I held him tightly, the rough canvas of my work jacket scratching against his white dress shirt. We stood there on the wet patio for a long time, letting the rain wash away the anger, leaving behind only the raw, honest truth of a mother and her son. The following Monday, I went back to work. Vance Industrial didn't stop running just because my personal life had fractured. The cranes still lifted tons of salvaged steel, the trucks still rolled in from the shipyards, and the scrap metal still needed to be sorted, melted, and shipped. But the rumor mill in the Seattle maritime community was spinning at full speed. By lunchtime, my office manager had heard 3 different versions of why the grand opening at the terminal had been cancelled. Some people said I had sued the Sterlings, others said Tyler and Chloe had embezzled money, one rumor even claimed there had been a physical fight on the docks. I didn't bother correcting any of them. In my 40 years of business, I had learned that people will always believe the version of a story that satisfies their own appetite for drama. Instead, I called Arthur Pendleton into my office. "I've been thinking about the waterfront terminal," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. Arthur smiled faintly, setting his briefcase on my desk. "I suspected you would. That usually means we have some restructuring to do." "It does," I nodded. "I'm not going to let that beautiful building sit empty, and I'm not going to sell it back to the Port Authority. But I'm also not going to hand the master lease over to Tyler on a silver platter." "What are you proposing?" "A family trust," I said, leaning forward. "We are going to restructure the entire asset. The terminal will eventually belong to Tyler, but not automatically, and certainly not now. Over the next 5 years, he has to earn it." Arthur pulled out a notepad. "Go on." "First, he has to participate in the actual day-to-day operations of Vance Industrial. I want him in a hard hat, on the sorting floor, learning how this business actually functions. He needs to understand where the money comes from before he spends it on polished concrete and high society galas. Second, a portion of the terminal's future revenues must be legally allocated to a community fund, specifically for trade school scholarships and local maritime clinics. And third, any major business decisions regarding the property must be approved by an independent board of trustees, which you and I will select." Arthur nodded slowly, his pen flying across the paper. "It's strict, Diane. But it's incredibly fair. It forces him to build character, not just a portfolio. Emily, his father, Marcus, would have wanted it this way," I said, correcting myself with a soft sigh. "Marcus always said that wealth without work is just a slow poison. I want to give my son the antidote." "I'll have the drafts ready by Thursday," Arthur said, closing his pad. He looked at me with a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. "You're a good mother, Diane." "I'm trying to be, Arthur." Finally. 3 weeks later, Tyler called me. He didn't ask about the lease, and he didn't mention Chloe. He simply asked if I wanted to get breakfast. We met at the small, Greasy Spoon diner near the dry docks where Marcus and I used to eat every Saturday morning when we were young and broke. The air inside smelled of fried bacon, cheap coffee, and diesel exhaust from the harbor. The elderly waitress, who had known my family for decades, slid 2 plates of thick pancakes and 2 mugs of black coffee onto our table. "My 2 favorite Vances," she smiled, patting Tyler on the cheek. "Glad to see you back where you belong, kiddo." Tyler looked down at his plate, his face flushing slightly. "Thanks, Martha." We ate in a comfortable, quiet rhythm. We didn't talk about lawyers, or contracts, or the Sterlings. Instead, we talked about Marcus. I told Tyler stories he had never heard, about the time his father accidentally dropped a 300-pound copper pipe into the harbor and spent 3 hours diving in his underwear to retrieve it because we couldn't afford to lose the scrap value. Tyler laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that I hadn't heard from him in years. "I forgot how much fun he was," Tyler murmured, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "I spent so much time trying to escape the smell of this place, Mom. I thought that if I could just get into those high society rooms, if I could just wear the right suits and talk to the right people, I'd finally be successful. But sitting in those rooms, I've never felt more empty." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. His skin was rougher than it had been a month ago. He had started spending his mornings working on the sorting line at the yard, and there were faint, dark smudges of iron dust under his fingernails. To me, those hands had never looked more beautiful. "Success isn't about the room you're in, Tyler," I said softly. It's about the person you are when you're standing in it. The transition of seasons in the Pacific Northwest is never sudden, it is a slow, damp deepening of gray, a gradual cooling of the wind that sweeps off the Pacific and channels through the Puget Sound. By late November, the autumn leaves had turned to dark mulch along the gravel paths of the Vance industrial yards, and the rain had settled into a permanent, icy mist. The massive yellow cranes of the port stood like ancient sentinels against the low-hanging clouds, their mechanical hum a constant, grounding rhythm to my days. I stood in the doorway of the main salvage shed, watching the steam rise from my coffee mug. The yard was quiet now, the day's shift having punched out an hour ago. But in the far corner of the shed, under the harsh glare of a halogen work lamp, a single figure remained. It was Tyler. He was bent over a heavy timber workbench, his shoulders moving in a rhythmic, determined motion. He was wearing a pair of grease-stained canvas overalls and heavy leather work gloves, using a stiff wire brush to clean a set of massive, oxidized copper marine gears we had salvaged from a decommissioned tugboat earlier that week. His face was smudged with carbon and rust dust, and his hair was damp with sweat. I walked over slowly, my boots crunching on the metal shavings that littered the concrete floor. I didn't say anything at first, I just stood at the edge of the light, watching him work. There was a focus in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years, a quiet, meditative concentration that completely lacked the frantic, anxious energy of his previous real estate endeavors. "You're going to take the teeth right off that gear if you keep scrubbing that hard," I said gently. Tyler stopped, his chest heaving slightly as he took a breath. He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, leaving a dark streak of grease across his brow. He looked down at the copper gear, then up at me, a tired but genuine smile breaking through the grime. "The oxidation is deep, Mom," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. "But look at the metal underneath. It's high-grade marine bronze and copper. If we clean this up and polish it, we can salvage the entire assembly. It's too well made to melt down. Your father always said the same thing about these old tugboat parts," I murmured, stepping closer and picking up a second wire brush from the tool rack. "He used to say that some things are built with enough pride that they deserve a second life, even if they've been sitting at the bottom of the harbor for 20 years. I joined him at the bench, our brushes working in tandem. The rhythmic scritch-scratch of the steel bristles against the metal filled the quiet shed. It was a familiar, comforting sound, one that anchored me to the decades Marcus and I had spent building this place from nothing. "Arthur called me today," Tyler said, his hands never pausing. "He said the Port Authority officially signed off on the revised master lease for the waterfront terminal." "And the trustees?" I asked. "Approved," Tyler nodded. "We're holding the first open house next week. No VIP lists, no security barricades. The lower level is officially set up as the new apprentice training facility for the local maritime union. We've got retired welders and machinists volunteering to teach kids from the trade schools. And the upper level. The city's health department is already moving in equipment for the community clinic." He stopped scrubbing and looked at his gloved hands, his expression softening. "Chloe called me yesterday. Just to finalize the division of the storage unit we shared downtown. She told me she's moving back to San Francisco. Her father is helping her open a new clinic down there. How are you holding up with that?" "I'm okay," Tyler said, and for the first time, I believed him. When we were together, I felt like I was constantly holding my breath, trying to be the person she wanted me to be. I was so terrified of being ordinary that I was willing to throw away the only people who actually loved me. When she told me yesterday that I was making a mistake by staying in the yards, that I was throwing away my potential, I didn't feel angry. I just felt sorry for her. She thinks success is a destination you reach by climbing over other people. She doesn't understand that if you don't like the person you are when you get there, the view doesn't matter." I set my brush down and reached out, placing my hand over his gloved fingers. "You are far from ordinary, Tyler. It takes an extraordinary amount of courage to admit when you've lost your way, and even more to turn around and walk back to the start." He looked at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm just glad you were still standing there when I did. I'm your mother, Tyler. I was always going to be standing here. I reached into the pocket of my canvas jacket and pulled out a grease-stained brown paper bag. Come on. Put the brush down. The gears can wait until tomorrow. Let's get some air. We walked out of the warm, dusty shed and down to the edge of the wooden pier that bordered our property. The rain had stopped, leaving the air incredibly clean and sharp with the scent of salt water, wet cedar, and distant cedar smoke. The lights of the Seattle skyline flickered across the dark, undulating surface of the Puget Sound, casting long, fractured ribbons of gold, emerald, and ruby across the water. I opened the paper bag and pulled out 2 portions of hot, greasy fish and chips wrapped in thick sheets of yesterday's newspaper. I handed one to Tyler, and we sat down side by side on the heavy wooden bumper of the dock, our legs dangling over the dark water. The food was hot and salty, the steam rising into the cold night air. We ate in a comfortable, easy silence, the newsprint absorbing the grease as we watched a massive container ship slowly navigate the shipping lanes toward the open ocean. Do you think Dad would be proud of what we're doing with the terminal? Tyler asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant ship. I know he would, I replied, taking a bite of the crisp batter. Marcus never cared about grand openings or high society investors. He cared about the people who built this city. He used to say that the true measure of a business isn't the profit margin on the balance sheet, it's the number of families it helps feed, and the strength of the community it leaves behind. By turning that terminal into a place of learning and healing, you are honoring his memory far more than any luxury clinic ever could. Tyler chewed thoughtfully, a soft breeze rustling his hair. I used to think that the smell of grease and iron on my clothes was a mark of failure. I wanted so badly to smell like expensive cologne and success. But working in the yard these past few weeks, seeing the guys work together, feeling the physical weight of the metal. I've never felt more grounded. I've never felt more like myself. That's because you're finally building on solid ground, son, I said, looking at him. When you build your life on appearance and the approval of strangers, every breeze threatens to knock you down. But when you build on character, respect, and hard work, you can stand against any storm Puget Sound can throw at you. The mist began to settle over the water again, a soft, silent shroud that blurred the lights of the city and made the harbor feel small and intimate. We sat there on the wet wood of the pier long after we had finished our food, watching the tide slowly rise against the pilings. There were no crowds, no photographers, no high society speeches, and no expensive champagne. There was only the cold salt air, the smell of grease and newsprint, and the quiet, unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Sometimes, life doesn't give us the future we planned. Sometimes, it tears down our grand designs and leaves us standing in the ruins of our own making. But if we are fortunate enough, and if we are willing to put in the work, it gives us something far better, a second chance to build something that lasts. As we stood up to walk back toward the lights of the yard, Tyler reached out and took my hand. His palm was rougher now, calloused from the wire brushes and the iron gears, but his grip was strong, steady, and entirely honest. Thanks for not giving up on me, Mom, he whispered. I squeezed his hand, the cold rain falling softly on our shoulders as we walked back toward the warmth of the shop together. Never, Tyler, I said. Never. Lessons from this story. Generosity is a gift that requires respect, not a transaction to be exploited. Shielding children from the consequences of their choices prevents them from developing strong character. True success is defined by personal integrity and hard work, not social status or the approval of others. Betrayal of family for material gain ultimately leads to isolation and failure.